All right, welcome. I am Mike Acton, and I'm VP of Dots at Unity. With me is Ray.
Yes, hey everybody, I'm Ray Graham. I'm the technical director of the Spotlight team over here at Unity.
And
Hi, I'm Kai Nyame. I am the creative director for Serpent Showdown and a student at USC Games studying interactive entertainment.
great. And Kai is who Ray and I are here to talk to today. So I, you were showing us your capstone project. Can you share your um, your trailer?
Yeah, sure. Let's go to screen sharing. Awesome. Was that all right? Could you hear that?
Yeah, I think that worked out all right.
That's great.
So, what did you do on that project?
So I was the creative director for Serpent Showdown when it was in production as a capstone project with USC Games. And so it meant that I got to lead a team of 20 students, both graduate students and undergraduate students that were studying games. And I got to direct them and help design with them through around 9 months in order to take a game from the concept to production to gold master and then through the publishing process.
So, when you say you led a team of 20 developers on the project, what does that mean concretely to you? What did you do?
I spent a lot of time in meetings with professors and a lot of time pitching the project, to be perfectly honest. But I also spent a lot of time with the development team, designing the actual game and the mechanics and the visuals, and then communicating between the different departments that we had, between the art team and the engineering team, for example, and helping translate the design documentation that we wrote up into actionable items for each of the different departments.
Okay, let's dig into that a little bit. If communicating, helping people understand each other was a big part of what you were doing. Can you give me a good concrete example of where you did that?
Yeah. So sort of a little bit about what we talked about earlier, but when we were designing the camera actions for the tutorial, we had originally a design document that was written up by the design team that explained how the camera would work visually, with a list of bullet points of first it does this, then it does that, then it zooms out, etc. And we took that and I took that document and gave it to the art team and said, hey, we have to make sure that the animations of the snakes fit in this. And they understood what was going on. But when I took that document to the engineering team, they were like, this isn't concrete enough. I don't have a task that I can turn this into. And so I had to spend a lot of time going back and using my personal experience as an engineer and as a designer to translate that document from, then it zooms out from here to what does that look like in Unity? What does that look like in the game scene, and what exactly is the camera doing, where is it pivoting from, and translate that documentation into actionable tasks for my engineers.
So what do you think? I mean, it sounds like you see as a core personal skill that you're sort of able to move from one mindset to another. What, especially along those sort of professional domains, what do you think is the challenge that the people on your team were having? Why is it that, in your view, that say the engineer that you were translating for wasn't able to do precisely what you did themselves?
I think it often comes to vocabulary and technology. And so, like, when you're working as an engineer, you're programming something, you're going to be using a very specific set of tools that has a very specific set of vocabulary. And, you know, if you're working on a game and an artist is also working on a game, they might not be working with the same tools that you are. They might be using a 3D modeling program or an animation program. And so the way that they approach completing a task or completing a problem is going to use different vocabulary. And on top of that different vocabulary, oftentimes you have to approach problems from a specific mindset when you're going through the development process. And those mindsets tend to be different depending on the role because of the particular part of the development pipeline that you're in. And so I have experience with art, the art part of the pipeline and the engineering part of the pipeline, and sort of design as well. And so being able to take my personal experience from, well, this is how I would have phrased it when I was animating, or this is how I would have phrased it if I was coding, really helped me translate the contents of you know, the information and the tasks that we were distributing to help everyone sort of get on the same page.
So if I'm understanding what you're saying, the sort of the reason why you feel that say that specific engineer was not able to bring that same level of translation to the table for themselves was that they just simply didn't have the practical experience with the tools and vocabulary that the artist was using. And since you have the experience, enough experience to be dangerous in both, you're able to translate a little better. Is that capture what you mean? Yeah. Ray, do you have some questions here in this space?
Well, I think, so how did you help that engineer understand both sides of that picture? Like, how did you basically bring those two sides together?
I think a lot of it was done in the comments tool in Google Docs, actually. And so we would set up a section where people would highlight the spots that they didn't understand, or they would highlight sections of the tech doc with the questions that they had. And then we could go through that with the design team. If an engineer left 3 or 4 comments, I could go to the design team or the art team and say, hey, what did you mean by that? And then help them formulate a reply. So we could sort of line up the vocabulary and line up the tech experience between the different programs in a way that helped everybody sort of understand what was what and how to translate from sort of the engineering brain to the art brain.
What was the most difficult example of not being able to really articulate the role?
I think it actually had to do with our combat design. So when we were originally starting out with the game, there was like 2 snakes and they would like sort of fight back and forth, and like even in me gesturing with my hands, I'm sort of going into that art brain section of like, and then they fought back and forth and you could see that. And so like the way that we talked about it with the art team was like, and then they slide around and then they do like a dodge roll and then they do like a backflip. And so we were like using all these visual terms And at one point we even had like these toy snakes that we were physically playing with in our dev space to like show how the animations would work. And the engineers came to me and they said, yeah, but what are the actual mechanics? Like, I know you said there's a backflip. Is that an attack? Is that a defense? Is like, what does it actually do to the other player? And so we had to take a step back and I had to say, okay, well, we have these animations and we have these snake actions, and how do we tie dodge out of the way is this particular animation, and the backflip is actually a counter move. And so like explaining that in a way that was clear from a technical perspective of when a snake throws a paper ball, you can do a counter move that uses the backflip animation in order to execute the counter, which then stuns the opponent snake.
So, that ends up being a little bit more of just about clarity and completeness, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I also heard, in there that building systems aspect, right?
Right.
Because there's the on one hand, what you're describing is an experience, like this and this is happening, and there's some backflips, and like feeling very excited, my hands are moving and doing all the things, and it's sort of like that experience that's happening. On the other side, it's the okay, what's the actual sort of system in place to make that happen?
Right.
So if we look at those two core things, right?
Mm-hmm.
What were the core experiences and what were the core systems?
The core experiences were going back and forth between the two different groups and having conversations with both of them and gesticulating wildly and trying to understand from both sides what the core design principles were from an engineering standpoint and an art standpoint. And the systems that got put in place were going back to that original tech document and having a line of communication open that was specifically about clarification questions. And in that, building sort of that shared vocabulary of when we say backflip, this is what it means in Serpent Showdown. And when we say, implementing an animation into the animation tree, this is what that means for the animation team, or this is what it means for the artist. And that this is how it ties into what the engineers are doing.
Right.
Yeah, but also, so how did you work with like the programming team to really define like the gameplay systems? Like, how did you guys actually get the details out of that?
We definitely started going to like game loop systems and like hand-drawn loops on our whiteboard in our dev space. And a lot of it was modifying the tech documents to have, we actually at some point did a color coding system where the translation for the technical side was in one color and the translation or the art related content was in a different color. And the documents would have information that was more complete because we had talked to both sides, and we would have the engineers write out what they thought was happening and the artists write out what the art team thought was happening, and then discuss that as a whole team on how do we move forward and how do we clarify this for everyone.
If I want to come back to the other thing you said, which is, I actually spent a lot of time pitching this.
Yeah.
So I want to hear more about that, but do you have some pictures you can share?
Yeah. Let's go into screen sharing again. So this is my team, or at least some of them. We actually had a space in a building that the school calls the Egg Building, and I'm not really sure why it's called the Egg Building. But our capstone team had a dev space with computers, And we all worked in the same space, engineers, artists, designers, animators, all together in one space. Yeah, there was a lot of sort of going up to people and tapping on their shoulder and sort of checking in on what was being done on one side, the engineering or the art or whatever. And we actually spent a bunch of time putting up the, I don't know if you can see it here. Here we go. We actually put a timeline. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but we put a timeline of a screenshot for every single week that we developed the game. And it was an in-game screenshot of the same scene. And it grew over time. We sort of kept all these visual reminders of what the core of the game was. So people had things to point to and people had things to pick up with their hands and have visual commonalities when designing together. Let's see, how do I get back to the call? There we go.
So to go back to the pitching question, tell me about that experience. What makes a good pitch?
I think the part about pitching that I learned the most from in pitching Serpent Showdown was like 90% of a pitch is about how you emote with your voice and your face when you're pitching. And like holding people's attention really has to do with like, yes, it's about the content, but it's about how excited you are about the content that you're talking about. Like if you're just like, oh, I made a game about snakes, it was cool, I guess. Like nobody, if you don't care, then nobody else cares. And so learning how to sort of put myself out there and say, I'm really excited. This is a game I've been working on for more than a year now, and I'm super excited to share it with everyone. People are automatically much more engaged and want to learn more because they care about it because you care about it.
Oh, great.
Cool. And so what was the, like, how did you even learn how to do a pitch? Like it sounds like you are very knowledgeable now about this whole process. Like, how did you come around to this realization?
Well, the professors in the capstone class had us pitching every single week. You know, you learn over time. The more times you say something, the more times you stumble over that same word in your pitch. You realize, do I actually need that word? Is that important to what I'm saying? Like, I think pitching consistently and pitching in front of an audience is really important, because being able to see people's faces as they react. Oh, they laughed at this point, but they didn't laugh at that point. Or nobody looked invested when I made this one joke, so maybe I shouldn't make that joke. Really helped, at least for me. And then I also would take the recordings, because they recorded all of the pitches. I took those recordings and I would listen to them afterwards and be like, wow, I sounded really awkward when I was trying to explain that you throw paper balls with the snake and then something. And you're like, okay, well, how do I rephrase that so that it's clearer and it makes more sense to anyone that's listening?
So if, aside from practice and practice in front of an audience, what would be the advice that you would give folks who want to improve their ability to pitch?
I think that knowing what the unique point about your game is, or your product is really important. And the emphasis that you put on, this is what's cool about it, and you should like it because this is what makes it amazing. And to truly sound like you think the thing is amazing is like 90% of it. Like when you're like, oh, it's about snakes, people are like, but why snakes? And you're like, because it's silly and they're wearing cardboard armor and they're throwing paper and jousting with crayons. Like, part of that is like, oh, I know that the game's unique point is that it's snakes fighting in a classroom, but part of that is the excitement in my voice and the interest that I have when I deliver that. And so like being aware of your delivery. And so like, yes, it's about practice, like, yeah, practice your delivery, but being aware of like at what points you have to be excited and what points you have to be technical is really important.
All right. Well, Ray, did you have any other questions along the capstone project?
Well, yeah, one question I had about it was, you're working in this environment, with students and with the rest of your teammates, and all this game development is going on. So the inevitable question comes up, like, what are some of the biggest challenges you had during this process? Like, where were you stretched, and what did you do about it?
I think one of the biggest challenges was the transition to online development and distributed development, because while we were in the middle of production, the shutdowns happened due to COVID. And so basically overnight, I think it was like spring break for the students. And then like the week after, like everyone went to class for 2 days, and then they were like, no more in-person class. Everything is remote and online. Start using Zoom immediately. Like switching that over and like learning how to keep the same habits and structures of team building and communication in the new distributed development section was the biggest learning challenge for me. Like when we were switching over, people would just like, when we switched over to online classes, people would just show up for meetings, and they stopped attending like the hangouts that we would do. We used to do game nights. We used to, show up at each other's apartments and, play D&D and sort of have that camaraderie. And when we got moved to online, like all of that was suddenly gone, because all of the habits and all of the, the weekly meetups weren't in person anymore. And so a lot of them got canceled because, you just couldn't go places. And like being able to see the team in a non-work environment, being able to chat and ask them how their day was, and make, those meaningful human connections, was lost for a while. And so I actually had to do some research on how do we do cross-platform gaming together? How do we do, casual hangouts in sort of this online Zoom age? So we started using, Parsec. We started playing Overcooked together, lots of Animal Crossing. And then I realized, well, if we're using Parsec to remote control like a local co-op game, why don't we use it to test Serpent Showdown? And so we started using Parsec to do remote tests. So I could play as player 1 and my engineer could play as player 2 from his apartment, and we could have that local competitive gameplay test from this remote environment. And so we got to sort of transform what was originally a problem of not being able to communicate into a way where we could communicate better and more engagingly. That's not a word. We can communicate and engage in a much more thorough manner.
So I'm going to take us in a little bit different direction now. And I'd like to ask what is development about for you?
I touched on this a little bit earlier, but development is like, yes, it's about developing a product, but it's really about the people that are both developing and the people that are playing your games. And like when you're developing something, like you're working in a team, and inherently, because games is such a cross-disciplinary field, you're going to have a lot of roles and a lot of people from a lot of different backgrounds. And so like creating an environment where people at the end of the day are happy and fulfilled is the most important part of design for me.
So how do you approach, practically speaking, for your team in this environment? How did you approach the question of, I want a happy and fulfilled team? That seems like a lot to ask for in terms of responsibility. So how did you approach it?
We started actually with building it into our production pipeline. And so when we knew that we had a deadline from the professors or like a deadline for our beta goal or whatever, we looked at the scope of our project and said, how do we set our scope in a way that makes sure that everyone can go home on Friday night and like go home and not be stressed, because everybody has homework or everybody has their part-time job, and like part of the thing that people on our team said was really important was their free time. And so we're like, okay, we're going to work on this game, we're going to make it as good as we can, but we're going to be cognizant of the fact that an overscope game would mean crunch for us, and I don't want to add crunch to my team because it would stress them out and it would make them unhappy. And so we initially cut features from the game because we were like, that's out of scope. And then when we completed the features that we had, we looked at the team and said, this is where we are, this is where the deadline is, what else do we want to add? And so that that choice to start with the MVP and start with that bare minimum pushed us into a work pattern that meant Fridays after we had our lab time, we would play Smash on the big TV because everybody was done with their tasks. And we weren't trying to push ourselves for more features until we knew that we had the time to do that.
So when you say you cut features, I'm assuming, and so you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I'm assuming that you mean that you sort of remove them from a piece of paper somewhere.
Yeah, we cut the features on the scope of the project that we wanted to build. And then once we met the goal of the minimum prototype, then we added the features on sort of as like, this is our wish list of features we'd love to have, but we're not going to get attached to them as this needs to be in the game.
So what are the other, aside from going home, what are there any other elements for you that really are an important part of building that sort of happy and fulfilled team that you wanted to build?
Yeah, obviously going home is an important one, but other things that are important for, at least for me, in developing sort of that safe team culture and that awareness is like knowing that you know your team and that your team is also like your family, or your team is also like people that you care about and that you trust. And so like I spent a lot of time trying to get to know my team members on an individual level, and like knowing when somebody had a big test coming up, like, oh, I know you have an exam or a midterm coming soon, how's that going? And making sure that everybody felt like they had someone looking out for them on that team. That I knew when somebody had a birthday coming up and we would do a potluck and bring in food for that person, or if somebody had like a religious observance, that we made sure that they had the space that they needed to do that. And like being aware and being communicative with the teams about what's important to them on a personal level, I think made it so much more welcoming because everybody wanted to spend time together. Everybody wanted to be in that space because there were people there that you wanted to spend time with. There were people there that you thought of as a friend, and as a confidant, and like being able to be in a space where your work also allows you to have that sort of relationship with your coworkers and with your team is really special.
Yeah, I don't really have a question on this, but I have more of a comment. Like from my experiences before, I asked a question one time. I was like, you know, why is making games so hard? Like, why is it so hard sometimes, right? And the answer back when I asked that question was like, it's the people, right? It's the people, it's the interconnectedness that we're all sharing. And so I find it really interesting that, you know, you are so people focused, right? Because I do think that is what makes the development process a lot easier when it is a welcoming and safe environment.
Right.
I really admire that. So.
And back on when we were talking earlier about like the language that's being used between engineers and artists in different roles, it's so much easier to create an experience and a space where people are willing to learn about other people's roles when people actually care about each other. Like if your engineer and your artist are friends, they like want to know what the other person is doing. They want to know, well, how does programming in Unity actually work? Or like, how does animating in Maya, like what's going on here? Like, what is this curve editor you speak of? And like, when you foster that dynamic between your team members, and you actually take time to set aside to let people be people and be human instead of just being a cog in the machine, it lets people be curious, and it lets people learn more and be willing to learn more, both for themselves in their own lanes, and then also across the team, and learning in a more cross-discipline manner.
So you also noted that it's not just the developers that are people that you care about, but also your players. How did that actually impact your work? What changes? What do you do with that information?
Right. So in sort of talking about like players as people, my design philosophy at least is like, how do you design an experience that's fulfilling for your player? And that starts with knowing who your player is and what they do and what were they doing before they started playing your game, or where were they, or what are their interests, who are their family. And with Serpent Showdown, when I first imagined people playing Serpent Showdown, I imagined like maybe a dad and his son, or like a high school student and their younger cousin. And there was very much this dynamic of I wanted people of all ages to be able to play and enjoy Serpent Showdown. And so the biggest question in designing Serpent Showdown was, how do we make Serpent Showdown accessible to all ages to play together? Not just, elementary school students can play it with elementary school students, but how do we make a fun experience that, you know, an adult can play with a child together, and both people have the same type of fulfilling experience. And a lot of that has to do with testing and learning about the things that you don't know. And for us, that was taking the game and bringing it to an actual middle school and letting middle schoolers play it. And letting middle schoolers play it with their teachers, and playing it with their friends, or having the college students play it with the middle schoolers, and how did they react? What did they understand? What did they not? And so in our tutorial, there was just language that wasn't clear for like a 9-year-old. And they were like, I don't understand what this is supposed to be, or I don't understand what it's telling me to do, or some of the things that they said to us. And one of the biggest ones was when you're holding a controller, if the tutorial text says, oh, use the bumper to attack, like if you're a kid that doesn't play games with a controller, you might not know what a bumper is. And so they were like, what does this mean? How do I attack? Or how do I defend? Or how do I do whatever? And so part of that designing for a fulfilling experience was listening to players and understanding what things they struggled with and sort of brainstorming, well, how do we design this to be more clear? How do we design this to be streamlined? And how do we design this so overall, when a player walks away, they're walking away with a smile on their face? So like adding pictures of the controllers as little scribbles on a Post-it note, or making sure that if they get stuck, there's a little flashing press the A button for more information. They can re-pop up the tutorial text once it goes away, so they can go back and revisit the explanation and stuff like that.
One of the things I heard you mention was that you also want to think about what people were doing before they sat down to
Right.
game. So what were you imagining people were doing before they sat down to play your game?
With the original idea, we had sort of in our minds like this cousin playing with their younger, or this person playing with their younger cousin, and we were thinking, well, where would they be where a cousin would be in the same room as their older cousin and they would be playing a video game? And so people are like, okay, well, maybe they're, at a family gathering, or they're at Thanksgiving, or the family's getting together for some sort of hangout event. And we're like, okay, well, from my experience, from like my childhood, when family get-togethers happened, there'd be like a living room and someone would be playing games on like a TV somewhere, and there's a lot of other things happening, and you're gonna get called to go to dinner, you're gonna get called to set the table. And so like being able to play the game and then put down the controller and like run and go do that other thing and then come back for like another round was something that I remembered when I was young. And so we designed Serpent Showdown's matches to be in rounds, and it resets at the end of every round. And so after a round happens, you can just like put down your controller and like run off and go do something and then come back and start another round or pick another character. And so sort of that bite-sized playtime we thought would be really good for families or people that have other things that are going on at the same time in their lives, be that like cooking dinner or like attending a party, or just like the game is not the center of their universe, and we have to acknowledge that. And so how do we make the play experience fun and let people walk away when they've had enough or they have other things to do, and then still be able to come back and have as much fun the next time.
Right.
I don't have anything to ask about that.
All right. Well, on that note, then, I mean, I think it's been really great getting to know you and learning more about you. What do you want people to do?
So Serpent Showdown is coming soon to PC and Nintendo Switch, and we'll put, I guess, a link in the description to that. But we're on social media at Serpent Showdown, and we'd really love it for anyone that's watching to play it when it releases and tell us what you think. Did it meet your needs as a player? What was your experience, and when you walked away after playing a couple rounds, how did it make you feel?
Awesome.
That's
Thanks.
great. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much, you guys.
Stop.
Nice.
Nice. Awesome. Neat.